Welcome back. So we just finished World War One, and now we're going to jump ahead to World War Two in the Middle East. This is an incredibly important topic that I actually spent a lot more time on in my History 111 class when I talk about World War Two in Europe, of course. But even in this course, we're going to see how World War Two infects everything, including the Middle East. And so that's going to be the focus on what we're going to do in this lecture. We're not going to spend quite as much time on World War II as we did on World War I, actually. In my 111 history and 111 class, I spend more time on World War II than World War I. In this class, we're just going to kind of go through briefly explaining some of the key effects of the war in Middle Eastern countries, especially like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, right? And we're going to talk about how the war impacted those nations and how they were involved. The first thing I do always mention, no matter what class I'm teaching World War II in, is the concern of people forgetting history. And, I always tell students this, that the generation that went through World War II, the generation that went through the Holocaust, which we'll touch upon in this class as well a little bit, the generation that went through Normandy and the Battle of Britain, the Battle of France and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, that generation is almost gone. And as that generation is passing, people are forgetting. And it is a great concern, actually, in the Middle East. For example, I don't know if you've heard of a man named Ahmadinejad, as you could see there, and I put the spelling up for you. He was the president of Iran for a number of years in the early 2000s, from about 2005 to close to about 2015, roughly 2013, I believe. And he was very adamant that he said the Holocaust never happened. In fact, I think even to this day, they may have stopped doing it, but definitely during his time, Iran would have a annual Holocaust denying cartoon contest, and it would be sponsored by their government. And in Turkey, Mein Kampf is a best-selling book, and they're not reading it for its historical merits. They're reading or historical kind of discussions. They're reading it because they kind of like the ideas in it. And so you see quite a few examples in the Middle East today of this. You see examples in Europe of this as well, but this is a Middle East history course, so I'm using these as examples. But the fact that people today, whether it's Europe, whether it's the United States, whether it's the Middle East, have forgotten and even tried to discount the Holocaust in World War II is pretty frightening. So even though this is a Middle East history course, we do kind of mention a little bit in terms of how the war started, and then from there talk about the rest of the events relating to the war. So again, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him before, the president of Iran, but if you don't know his name, you should. And again, Mein Kampf, I'm assuming everyone's heard of that book that Hitler wrote. That again, in many years, it's not always the #1 selling book of Turkey or anything. I don't want to make you think that, but it is a popular book there. And I just use that as an example because Turkey is a Western ally. And even there, you see the book popular, right? You see a lot of anti-Semitism throughout the Middle East, of course, and we'll cover some more of that a little bit later when we talk about some other elements of the war. So the war itself, how does it start? Well, go ahead, jot all this down, and then I'm going to go to a map and kind of explain to you how World War II starts in the Middle East. So just, first we'll talk about general how the war begins, and I'm going to go to a map here, but let's start with World War I and Hitler, then I'll go to a map to explain the rest of it. How does World War I help start World War II? Well, World War I was absolutely devastating. When Hitler starts to come into power in 1932, Europe had gone through the war, World War One, and the wounds of World War One was very raw still. It wasn't that long earlier. It was bloody, it was brutal. Millions of people died in this horrific trench warfare. And they're like, well, we don't want to fight anybody. And so as Hitler rose into power, the policy that was dominant in Europe was appeasement. So all of this is connected, right? World War One, Hitler, and appeasement. So World War I was this devastating war. Then Hitler rises to power. Again, in my Western civilization class, I go into a lot of detail on that. And then as Hitler comes into power and does all these outlandish, horrible things, the European powers choose to appease him. What does that word appeasement mean? Well, appeasement is basically when you let let people do whatever they want because you want them to stop screaming, yelling, and crying. Yeah, I have my little baby, or it's not a little baby anymore, toddler. And toddlers, if they don't get what they want, they scream and yell. And if you give in to them, they know all I have to do is scream and yell, and I get what they want. And that's kind of appeasement. And one of the reasons that European powers were so willing to appease Hitler was because they didn't want to deal with the brutality that they saw in World War I, which ironically will mean that Hitler will become stronger and they'll be even more damaging than anything that happened during World War I. So that's kind of the dark irony of it. I'm not going to go through all the appeasement examples in this class, but I'm just going to go through a couple things real briefly and show you this on a map. So get these terms down, right? Go ahead, get them all down, and then I'll briefly mention examples of appeasement. But this is essentially how World War II starts in Europe. This is, again, it's a much more complex, much more detailed, but that's for a History 111 course. All right, so make sure you got all these terms down. And here's our map. So what happens from 1932 to 1939 is Hitler will begin to do many things out of Germany. One of the things he'll begin to do is build up his military, build up his weaponry, his air force, and the European powers appease him. One of the other things he'll do is he'll move his troops into a piece of land called the Rhineland. The Rhineland is areas that were part of Germany, but under World War I agreements, that area was supposed to be demilitarized. That France especially said, well, we don't want any troops there in the Rhineland because, you might invade us. Germany, Germany and France have been enemies for a long time, and we want this kind of buffer zone. And so we want this buffer zone, and Hitler don't move any troops into the Rhineland. Well, in 1936, Hitler moved his troops into the Rhineland, and nobody did anything about it, and that really emboldened Hitler. And then a couple of years later, he moves into the Sudetenland area over here, 1938, and Sudetenland was part of Czechoslovakia. And at that point, the Prime Minister of England at the time was a man named Neville Chamberlain. Again, you had all those terms there in the previous slide, so I hope you got them all down. And Neville Chamberlain basically tells Hitler, you can't do that. You can't go and take over another nation or parts of another country, specifically the Sudetenland, parts of Czechoslovakia. And they have this big meeting called the Munich Conference, and Hitler goes to Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, and says, just let me have the Sudetenland. I promise, promise, promise I'll be good. I won't take over any more land. And Neville Chamberlain, like an idiot, believed him. And as a result of that, this leads to, Hitler being even more emboldened. And then he takes over all of Czechoslovakia. He had already formed an alliance with Austria. And he's just very strong and powerful until 1939, he moves into Poland. And so by 1939, after 7 years of appeasing Hitler, he had built his strength, built his military base, he had conquered land, moved into Czechoslovakia, moved into Poland, and the war begins. And the United States is not in the war, Russia is not in the war when it begins. And so it's basically England and France primarily trying to fight this juggernaut of Germany, which has now also got Austria. Italy is, of course, united with Germany. And again, this is it's a lot more detail to all this. If you want, you could go on my YouTube channel and watch all my lectures on World War II to get all the full detail on it, or you just take the History 111 course if you haven't done that. You don't need that for this class, but my point is it's a very detailed sequence of events. I'm not focusing on it too much in this class because our concern is really, so what about the Middle East, right? This is how the war begins, the rise of Hitler, appeasement. If you kind of have that basic understanding, I'm happy for this class. What we want to know is, how did the Middle Eastern nations get involved? And so we'll start with Turkey, and we'll talk about the role of Turkey first, and then we'll go through the other ones. So Turkey during World War II was led by this man named Unonu. He was the new president of Turkey. So if you remember in the previous lecture, I said Mustafa Kemal was the first president of Turkey. Unonu is the second president of Turkey. And when World War II begins, actually, go ahead. I'm going to show you this on a map again. Go ahead and get all this down, get these terms down. And then I'm going to go ahead and explain what this leads to and the role Turkey plays in the war. So this is, the map of the war itself. And so when the war begins, as I mentioned, it was England and France over here fighting against primarily Germany and Italy and and then of course Japan and all of that. And so when the war starts, Germany uses this blitzkrieg and without getting into tremendous detail, conquers much of Western Europe very quickly, including France. There's this big battle known as the Battle of France in June of 1940. Turkey is sitting here, and you can see Turkey on this map is designated as neutral during the war. And that was primarily the decision of UNONU. Why? Well, because Turkey was in a situation where they had a lot of trade with Germany. They also didn't want to upset Russia. They didn't want to upset France. They're a fairly new nation, of course, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so they're like, well, we don't want Germany to win. We don't really like everything that they're doing, and so forth, but we don't really want to rock the boat too much. And so at first they were kind of a little bit neutral when things started. Then Germany just destroys France, right? This Battle of France, the southern part of France, known as Vichy France, Vichy, just collaborate with Hitler. That was that man named Pétain, was a man named Henri Pétain. Henri Pétain was a Nazi collaborator inside of France who helped Germany conquered the southern part of France. So again, long story short, France is just demolished, and Turkey saw what happens as a result of the Battle of France, and then very quickly in 1941 signs not an alliance with Germany. They officially signed a friendship agreement, as it was called, or a non-aggression pact with Germany. And so Turkey and Germany signed a non-aggression pact, and that's basically Turkey's role in World War II. There isn't much to say. We're not going to spend as much time on World War II as we did World War I because the big powers aren't that involved. Turkey's just like, we're out, right? We're not dealing with this. After they saw France just get demolished, they were like, we'll sign a non-aggression pact with you, Germany, and they stayed that way until 1945. By 1945, when the tide of the war completely changed, the United States gets involved. Then Turkey said, hey, we're with you, the Allies. We're going to fight against the Germans. But it's like, okay, great now. Where were you when, everyone was being slaughtered? And so Turkey really took this position of neutrality during the war. They just didn't want to get their hands bloodied. Ironically, again, World War I was probably the war they should have stayed out of, and they jumped in. World War II was the one that they probably should have gotten more involved, and they stayed out, right? But that's true of a lot of powers in Europe. And here also you can see on the map Ankara, that's the capital city that I mentioned before. I don't think I pointed out to you where it is on the previous map, so there it is. So that's it. That's all you really need to know about Turkey. They're not that involved, but that matters, right? So that's part of World War II in the Middle East. They stay uninvolved. They don't get too much into the weeds of the war till the very end where it doesn't matter much. Now, I will say this, I will add one last point, that because they do get involved at the end, they will become an important player after the war in terms of the Cold War, but we'll talk about that in another lecture. Another country that I want to talk about a little bit is Iran. And so Iran's role in World War II is interesting. So if you remember after World War I, we talked about Reza Shah, the father, and I said how he modernized Iran and did things really well in Iran, but I also said he's going to make one big mistake. When the war happens, eventually, as World War I goes on, 1939 it starts, 1941 the U.S. gets in the war, 1941 Soviet Union's in the war, and you can see if you're a European power and you need to get things to Russia, right? You kind of almost have to go through the Middle East, right? If you want to get supply, you can't go through Nazi-controlled Europe, right? Nazis control all of Europe, so that avenue is gone. But if you can get through parts of the Middle East, then you can bring supplies and goods into the Soviet Union. And I'm assuming you know this. If you don't know this, Germany will eventually invade the Soviet Union, and then what happens is the Soviet Union, the United States, once they get in the war after Pearl Harbor, England, they're all allied together, right? So even though the United States and the Soviet Union and England and the Soviet Union are these historical enemies, if you think about it, right? The Cold War and everything, People asked Winston Churchill during about World War II, and siding with Stalin, like, how can you side with Stalin? He's such an evil monster. And Churchill's replies is, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd have a few nice things to say about the devil. And so as the war goes on, and the Soviet Union gets involved, it was necessary for the British and the Americans to help the Soviet Union. And one way to do that was to go through Iran, because Iran shares borders with the Soviet Union. So Reza Shah is approached by the United States in 1941-42, and he's asked by the U.S., hey, we need to go through Iran to give supplies to the Soviet Union. And the Shah says no. And they're like, well, we kind of got to go through. And the Shah says no. And the United States says, well, we're going to go through. We have to. We have to do this. We're fighting, the greatest evil in human history. We're going to do this. And not only did he say no, he then tried to resist the American and British forces, which eventually led to, this is the kind of the mistake I talked about at the end of their lecture, eventually led to him to be abdicated. He had to step down. He couldn't govern. And this is going to lead to about 13 years of great instability in Iran. Reza Shah is going to die in 1944, so he first has to abdicate, then he's going to die, and Iran is just going to have to deal with the fact that they're going to be kind of in this kind of like World War I situation, in this kind of crosshairs of the war. And probably if Reza Shah had just said, you know what, I'm going to ally with England and the US, and I'm going to work here, then maybe you don't have the instability in Iran that's going to follow. And again, we're going to do a lecture on after World War II in Iran. So one of the reasons this lecture is a little bit brief on all these topics, Turkey, Iran, we're going to talk about Iraq here as well in a second, in Egypt, is because the real stories are after the war. But I do want you to know what happens during the war, because it's going to help trigger some of the things after the war. So again, Turkey's neutral. Iran tries to resist the American and British help to the Soviet Union. That leads to Iran being overrun, and it leads to the Shah abdicating and instability in Iran, which will follow, which again we'll do in a separate lecture. The next thing we want to talk about after we talk about Iran is Iraq, nearby. So if you remember with Iraq, and I'm going to show you a name of an important person here in a second, after World War I, Iraq fell under the British mandate, but eventually Iraq will get its independence. By 1932, Iraq will be an independent nation, right? So 1932, Iraq will be independent. And then, of course, the war breaks out, and what happens with Iraq is interesting during the war. Because like the other Middle Eastern countries, they were kind of wanting to be more neutral, but they weren't sure what to do with things. And there was this interesting rivalry that develops in Iraq between two people. So here are a couple names I want you to know. A man named Nouri al-Assad. When World War II began, Nouri al-Assad, he was in charge of Iraq. He was the prime minister of Iraq. And he agreed to not help Germany. He signed an agreement with England to support England and not get involved. However, around 1940, when all this was happening, Hitler had a lot of popularity in Iraq. And you say, why would Hitler be popular in Iraq? Well, one of the interesting stories about Iraq in these years that I know very, very, very well about, and it's not from reading in books, it's not from my travels, it's actually from my own personal family life experience, is the Jewish population in Iraq. During this period of time, there was a large Jewish presence in Iraq. My grandparents were Iraqi Jews. And the Jewish population in Iraq was very successful. They were involved in medicine, in science, in business, and mathematics, and a lot of things there in Iraq. However, they weren't always very popular in Iraq because they were Jewish. They faced a lot of anti-Semitism. And there were people in Iraq, such as this man named Rashid Ali, who gained a lot of support from the Nazis and Hitler. And what had happened is Rashid Ali, in fact, comes into Iraq, or he is in Iraq, and for a short time period takes control of Iraq with some support from the Nazi powers. This eventually leads to the British getting involved in Iraq, pushing Rashid Ali out. Nuri al-Assad comes back into power. But the fact that this man, Rashid Ali, even had any momentum really was an indication of the Jew hatred that existed inside of Iraq. And if it wasn't for the British getting involved, a lot of the Iraqi Jews may have faced the same fate that the European Jews faced. As it turned out, the Jewish people in Iraq remained safe because Nuri al-Assad, who was more allied with the British, didn't go after the Jewish people in the same way that the Jews are going to be, attacked in Europe and, of course, sent to gas chambers and executed. What will eventually happen, however, is the Jewish people in Iraq will be forced out of Iraq. And this actually happened to my grandparents. My grandparents took my parents when they were children, and they were all ousted out of their homeland. The Jews in Iraq were kicked out. And some wanted to leave, some didn't want to leave, and they were kicked out. Even the ones that willingly wanted to leave, everything they had was taken away from them. It's actually an interesting personal story. My parents don't even know when they were born because even their birth certificates and their paperwork were all taken away from them. And they ended up being refugees for a while, living in tents because of their simple fact that they were Jewish people living in Iraq. So while the Jewish people in Iraq and other Middle Eastern nations did not face the Holocaust per se, they didn't face the gas chambers per se, there was a lot of persecution in Iraq of Jewish people and around the Middle East of Jewish people. And so this is something that we kind of see in the story of Iraq. So there's kind of back and forth. So Nuri al-Assad, again, he was the one supported by the British. Rashid Ali, he was the one who was supported by the Nazis. And at the end of the day, it was Nuri al-Assad who emerged victorious. But again, it was still a struggle for the Jewish people inside of Iraq all the way until eventually all the Jewish people were exiled out of Iraq. And that's after World War II comes to an end, but is all during these years. Okay, so I hope all that's clear. If you have any questions about that, of course, let me know. All right, one more country that's involved, and that's Egypt. And Egypt is, of course, key because of its geographical location. And so just get these few little terms down, and then I'm going to show you a map of Egypt and talk about how Egypt involved in World War II as well. Okay, so pause if you need. Just one battle we're going to talk about and a couple names. Suez Canal. All right, so over here we have Egypt. Here, of course, we got the Suez Canal area, and that's why Egypt is important, right? If you don't control whoever controls the Suez Canal controls trade into the Red Sea, all the way into, around the globe. If you think about it, if you don't have control of the Suez Canal, you got to sail all around. It gets cut off, all right? You got to go all the way out and down and around Africa if you're going to get into the same seas. And so it's very important, the Suez Canal. And so as a result of that, both Hitler and the Allies won it. There'll be a big battle there called the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. Hitler sends one of his best men, a man named Erwin Rommel, to fight against the British, who were led by Montgomery. So Montgomery, that key name I gave you before, he was the British general. Erwin Rommel, interesting guy. Go into more detail about him in my Western Civ class as well. He was the Nazi military man who later on tries to get rid of Hitler. So it's a crazy little story. He was nicknamed the Desert Fox. And there's this big battle, a big tank battle between them. Let me give you just a couple stats that you probably should jot down. But Rommel had with him 150,000 men and 600 tanks. And the British and the U.S. forces combined, because the U.S. was there as well, had 200,000 men and 1,100 tanks. So you could just try to visualize 600 tanks and 1,100 tanks, coming together in this battle site that was about 150 miles west of Cairo. So you could see Cairo. I don't know if you could see it well on this map, but here's the city of Cairo. So the battle was about 150 miles west, kind of right up here, actually. You could kind of see it here, right there. Anyways, when I get into all the detail, eventually the Allies win. The British and the Americans win. They forced Rommel to retreat out of this battle. It goes until 1943, so this is not a battle that ends overnight. But this is a very important turning point in the war, and Egypt was at the center of it. Many people believe the Battle of El Alamein is one of the key points where World War II is going to begin to turn in favor of the Allies. But even after the Battle of El Alamein, Hitler still has very firm control over Europe, and the war is not over. But to summarize real quickly here, again, the four major areas you need to know about: Turkey, mainly neutral. Iran gets picked apart because of its geographical location. Iraq had the issue between Nouri al-Assad and Rashid Ali, and you want to know that kind of brief conflict. And for Egypt, it's the story of the Suez Canal. So there isn't a lot about any of them. There's just a little bit I pointed out on each one. But you do want to know those few little points about how these Middle Eastern nations were involved in World War II. So again, not quite as much detail as World War I. World War II, how it ends, just real briefly here, of course, if you're not familiar with it, June 6, 1944, D-Day, when we have this massive invasion into Europe, Normandy. This eventually leads to May of 1945, what we call VE Day, where victory in Europe, where eventually Hitler falls. Hitler is going to commit suicide April of 45, and by May of 45, the war is over in Europe. And then in August of 1945, we use the atomic bombs in Japan. That, of course, ends the war in Japan, and World War II is over. But it took unbelievable amount of effort and casualties. I'm not sure if you're aware, but over 50 million people died fighting World War II. So there's only one other thing I want to mention about World War II and how it relates to the Middle East, and that's, of course, the Holocaust. So this is an interesting photo, a very rare photo of a man named the Grand Mutfi al-Husseini, and a man, of course, Hitler. And the man al-Husseini here that you see was in what is modern-day Israel, specifically in Jerusalem. What at the time was Palestine, which was controlled again by the British at this point. The British controlled this land during World War II. And during the war, this man, the Grand Mutfi al-Husseini, he allied with Hitler. They met in 1941, and they were openly talking about how can they rid the Jewish population in the Middle East. Now, that doesn't happen, right? The Jewish population in the Middle East is not, as I said, all gassed and put to death the way they were in Europe. But the reason I mention this and show this is because it does emphasize, this was a very big leader in what is modern day Israel at the time. Palestine, he represented many of the Arab people in the region. And this really kind of shows the connection and the Jew hatred that existed there. And this is going to be important as we get into our future lectures on the birth of the State of Israel and the conflicts there and why Israel is created. And this is in part has to do with how all this unfolded in the Middle East. So just know his name, know that he was trying to form an alliance with Hitler, know again he is in what is modern day Israel, at the time called Palestine, which was under British control, but he was one of the local leaders there. The Grand Mutfi is his title, right? And he was very much willing to talk with Hitler how to end the Jewish people in the area. And so that's an important point. There's some other issues regarding the Holocaust that kind of tie into eventually the story of the creation of the State of Israel. One thing that maybe you've heard of before, a few names, Pius XII, he was the Pope at the time, and Pope Pius XII took a position of neutrality during World War II regarding the Holocaust. He didn't really speak up against it. You had stories like the ship known as the St. Louis, right? The St. Louis, which was a ship of Jewish refugees trying to make its way to the United States. And the Franklin Roosevelt administration turned the ship back. And it was a group of Jewish refugees that ended up going back to Europe and were, of course, all executed. And so, as these stories happened during the war, where there was very little protection for the Jewish people, we know that 6 million Jews were murdered. And one of the questions that sometimes comes up was, and this is an important question, I want you to listen very carefully to this. What impact did the Holocaust have on the creation of the Jewish state? Because after World War II, there will be the state of Israel created, right? And we'll do several lectures on that. It's going to be a lot of lectures on that, explaining all the events leading up to it, and then the creation of the states and the conflict. But one of the biggest myths, and this is a very important one, is that people will sometimes say it was because of the Holocaust that the state of Israel was created. That is a myth. It is not true. And in fact, the exact opposite is true. The Holocaust happened because there was no state of Israel. I found this quote and explains it really well in an article, so just kind of listen to this. Yom HaEtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, follows Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah is the Holocaust Memorials Day. That is fitting. Had there been in Israel 20 years sooner, in other words, if there had been in Israel 20 years before World War II broke out, before the Holocaust, there would have been one place on earth that would have taken the Jews prior to the Holocaust, when Hitler was willing to let many leave. And during the Holocaust, one country would have fought for them by bombing Auschwitz, for example. There was no place for the Jewish people to go. There was no state of Israel. So it wasn't that the Holocaust brought about the creation of the state of Israel. It was that because there was no Jewish state, there was no safe haven for the Jewish people, the Holocaust happened, right? And that's a very common misconception. Even people who are educated in this go, yeah, because they look at the domino effect. They go, well, World War II ends, then the state of Israel is created. Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely the Holocaust kind of forced the hands of European powers to recognize the state and that there should be a state of Israel, but there was already discussions of having a state before the war. It just never transpired till after the war. If it had happened earlier, then the Jewish people would have been able to be safe and they would have had a safe haven. When Jewish people tried to go to Palestine, at the time it was called Palestine, before it was Israel, the British wouldn't let them even in there. They wouldn't, the St. Louis, right? They couldn't get refuge anywhere. Europeans, they didn't have much refuge. The Pope stayed neutral. And so this really impacted the Jewish population. These two terms I also want you to know, Sephardic and Ashkenazi. What are these terms? When you talk about Jewish people, when you look at Jewish people, people say, you look Jewish. Well, that's ridiculous. No one can look Jewish. You could be black and you could be Jewish. You could be Asian, you could be Jewish. You could be European and you could be Jewish. You could be white, black, any color, you'd be Jewish. It doesn't matter. Jewish is a faith. It's a religion. Just like you can't look at somebody and tell if they're Christian or if they're, Muslim or any other faith. But there is kind of ethnicities, I guess you could say, and there's two groups of Jewish people, Ashkenazi Jews, which are European Jews, and Sephardic Jews, who are the more Middle Eastern Jews, right? North African, Middle Eastern Jews. And so one of the things that does happen is it is the Ashkenazi Jews who are, of course, more heavily massacred and persecuted during the war. And this is what I was talking about before with Iraq. Like my grandparents, they're Sephardic Jews, they're Middle Eastern Jews, and while they weren't put in gas chambers, they were also not allowed to kind of have anything when they left. And in fact, for a long time, they had to secretly try to get out of Iraq. There's an interesting book called Operation Babylon, about the Jews trying to leave Iraq, for example, where they would have kind of in the middle of the night, people would get on planes and try to fly out of Iraq and try to get out of there because they wanted to go to Israel or Palestine again, as it was called at the time. And I'll explain the terminology when we get to the other lecture, why I keep going Palestine, Israel. We'll explain that in more detail later on. But that story of the Sephardic Jews was difficult, but it was not as horrible as what happened to the Ashkenazi Jews. but they were both facing kind of different forms of persecution during the war. So we'll talk about this again later on when we do the lecture on the modern state of Israel and the birth of Israel. We'll talk about that. So, anyways, that's a little bit about World War II in the Middle East. It's kind of a little bit here, a little bit there. I understand that, but everything we mentioned, you do want to know, obviously. And then from here, where we're going to go on is talk about, and this is one of my favorite sets of lectures. The next few topics is what happens after the war, and I like this next topics that we're going to get into because we're going to take Turkey. And we're going to cover Turkey from World War II to today. We're going to cover Iraq from World War II to today, Iran from World War II to today. Not quite to today, but I cover them all the way at least to the year 2000s, right? Early 2000s. And so you get a sense of kind of how these things develop all the way into our much more modern times. So that's going to be the next few lectures, what happens after World War II to countries like Turkey, Iran, Iraq. We'll get into, Saddam Hussein and the Ayatollah in Iran and all sorts of interesting stories in Turkey and all these things. But I hope all that's clear. It's a little bit longer lecture. I just made it one long lecture as opposed to breaking it up into a couple lectures. But again, hopefully you got everything. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right, thank you.